This is known in the Bible as capital T, the, well, not necessarily in the Bible, but in biblical history. This is known as capital T, the, capital C, captivity. The Babylonian captivity. The history of the Bible has been leading to this point. In fact, as you read the Bible, you come to the first 5 books of the Bible, which are known as the Law of Moses, or in Hebrew, the Torah, the Word from God. You come to those first 5 books, and in some ways you can say, okay, that's the law that we broke, and that's why God carried us off into exile. And then everything after the law is basically the history of how we got to this point in biblical history. And so I know that the whole point of me sharing Bible study about Bible stories with you has been to educate you in the same way I was educated as a child. But I tell you what, if you'd have told me King David and Noah were neighbors and hung out together, I would have believed you as a kid, because we just had a loose collection of stories in my mind, and I felt like I knew all of them. And I think some of the church members where my dad was pastor were convinced that I knew all of them, but all of the Bible stories. But many times when you do grow up in church, you get all these stories floating around in your head. You know, David killed Goliath, and they shouted, and the walls of Jericho came falling down. But it's good to have a framework to hang all of those stories on. And I tell you what, in some ways, the children of Israel getting carried off into exile is the climax of the Old Testament. As I was saying, even as far back as books like Genesis that tell us about the flood, and they're the beginning of the law of Moses, and God shows His people. God had an elderly couple give birth to a child when they had no business having a child in any physical way, shape, or form. And that is how God chose His people. He provided a miracle that they even existed in the first place. And not only that, but He's the God who made the world. So He's the God in charge. And all of that together in those first 5 books. And you can't eat this, and you can't eat that, and you can't wear this, and you got to worship on these days, and all that. That is the law of the children of Israel. The scholars in the Jewish community in the Empire of Babylon would point to that and say, that is the law that we did not keep. And that is why God allowed us to be carried off into the Babylonian captivity. And on through Judges and Ruth, people did a pretty good job of living up to the law. But then again, it was a time when there was no king in the land. And every man did what was right in his own eyes. And you get into the kings. Some of the kings led us in following the law and worshiping God. And some of the kings really dropped the ball. In fact, in the northern kingdom, when the kingdom split, because of David's unfaithfulness to the law of God, in the northern kingdom, they never really did follow the law of God. They set up golden calves. I don't even know how they remembered the golden calf hundreds of years later. But there was probably I think there had to have been maybe a subset of people who just continued to worship that false god all through that time. In fact, Jerry said to me this morning, we got some good preachers to listen to on TV and radio. And I said, yes, I do, but you'd think that with all these good preachers, we'd be doing a lot better by now, wouldn't you? And in the northern kingdom of Israel, you run into prophets. Not only is there Elijah and Elisha, but there's all these unnamed prophets, and there's the sons of the prophets. And the servant of the king, Obadiah, hides 100 prophets of God. And it's like, well, they had 100 prophets of God. Why are things so bad? Prophets are falling out of trees, and people still aren't listening in that northern kingdom. Isn't it a shame? Isn't it a shame? And ultimately, as Jonah went and preached to the capital of Nineveh, he didn't even want to go. Good thing the rest of us preachers don't ever have that problem. Don't want to get up, don't want to preach, don't want to serve God. And went and preached to Nineveh. They repented. In sackcloth and ashes, the pagans repented when they realized that they had messed with God's law, that they had made God angry. And they survived, the Assyrian Empire survived long enough to utterly destroy the northern kingdom of Israel because they wouldn't follow the law of God. God had told them way back in Moses' day, if you follow my law, if you're obedient to me and you serve me and only me, I will bless you so that all the world will see that I am your God, and that because you follow me, I have richly blessed you. And if you don't, I, as your God, am still going to come out on top, because then all the world will see that you didn't worship me, and that I allowed plague and famine and pestilence and invaders to come in and destroy you. And the whole world will know that I'm the true God, because I warned you, and you didn't listen, and I still fulfilled my word. Just like when that storm was on that ship of Jonah's, and the minute they threw Jonah overboard, we made some believers out of some pagan sailors. Boy, how did they realized when that storm went calm, the minute Jonah was thrown off the boat, that, we're not talking about these gods that we all know never really answer us. We're talking about the real God that made the earth and the sea. This is a big point in biblical history, just to give you an idea. If you know your books of the Bible, you know that there are some prophets who surely got carpal tunnel from all the writing they did. They got these big books, right? Many people think that the book of Psalms is the longest book of the Bible. It has the most chapters, at 150 chapters. By word count, the longest book of the Bible is Jeremiah. That's exactly right. And Genesis is the second, and Ezekiel is way up there somewhere. And Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is a prophet in the southern kingdom during the time when the Assyrian army comes down and destroys the northern kingdom. And once the northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrian Empire, there's nothing left between the little kingdom of Judah, David's throne, and Solomon's fantastic temple. There's nothing between them and the Assyrian Empire. There's no buffer zone of the northern kingdom anymore. And so they are sitting ducks. But Isaiah has a message for the king of Judah. The king of Judah who has torn down the idols, and the king of Judah that has torn down the high places and said, you must worship only God, and you must only worship Him in His temple. And he's obedient to God. Isaiah brings a message to him. God is still on your side. God is not going to let the Assyrians conquer you. Unfortunately, that king's son grows up to be the worst king in the history of Judah. He surpasses being like one of the kings of the northern kingdom, and he goes straight to being compared to the pagan kings who lived in the land before God brought in the children of Israel. And for 40 years, he led them in idol worship. We told his story last week, King Manasseh. And after him, there's some reforms. But by and large, the kings still lead the people in doing evil. And they are destroyed 200 or so years after the northern kingdom. So we have Isaiah's 66-chapter huge volume of his prophecies from when the northern kingdom gets destroyed. And then we come to the time when God is warning His people, this is your last chance. In fact, it's not even your... In the book of the prophet Jeremiah, the word of the Lord comes to the prophet Jeremiah, and he's a young man when it starts out, and he has a long ministry until he's an old man. Excuse me, throat tickle. And he writes the longest book of the Bible in the process, and what he has to tell the people is, it's too late. The Babylonians are invading, and it's of God, so open the doors and let them in, because you brought this on yourselves. As you can imagine, Jeremiah was not a very popular prophet, because in times of war, everyone wants to hear the patriotic thing, God is going to deliver us. Don't worry, God is going to come through for us. We don't ever care about God. We don't ever worship God. We have betrayed God over and over and over again, and God has let us this go on for a long, long time. But don't worry, God's going to swoop in at the last second, and no. God has had enough. And it's not just that your ancestors betrayed God. It's that you yourselves have within your hearts the same rebellion. And you refuse to worship only the Lord your God. So I'm going to allow you to go into exile. I'm going to allow you to live as a minority in a foreign land, surrounded by pagans, with a pagan temple on every corner, just about. I was looking at a map of the city of Babylon the other day, and it's boy howdy, walking on foot, walking past all these big pagan temples. Man, it must have given Daniel I'm sure he felt like a fish out of water. I'm sure he did. But you're going to thrive there. Jeremiah told them, you're going to thrive there. Don't fight it. Go off into captivity and seek the prosperity of the Babylonian Empire, because when it prospers, you will prosper. You know, there are two major lessons we are supposed to learn from the Babylonian exile. And that is that even when the enemy king, the pagan that doesn't worship the Lord, conquers your city, destroys your temple, and carries your people off, it doesn't mean God lost or that God was overpowered. The number two lesson is, from this point on, God's people live as a minority in a pagan land. And can you think of anything more relevant to our life today about how we live as a minority in a land surrounded where people don't agree with our virtues, people don't agree with our values, the government and the system and the society as a whole, all those written and unwritten rules that dictate how we are supposed to behave. Some of them might agree with what the Lord has told us to do. Some of them might not. And we have to make a choice